Imagine a nation, proud and unyielding, suddenly paralyzed by hunger, not from defeat in battle, but from an invisible enemy lurking beneath the waves. Japan's mighty fleets and ironclad confidence were no match for the silent hunters of the Pacific, American submarines. Night after night, they prowled the ocean, cutting off lifelines, leaving convoys stranded, and shocking commanders who had believed their empire was untouchable. Food, oil, ammunition, everything Japan relied upon to survive the war was being strangled by an enemy they could neither see nor predict. Families went hungry, soldiers grew weak, and the morale of an entire nation teetered on the brink. In this video, we reveal how a few daring submarines managed to starve a superpower, humiliate its top commanders, and alter the course of history forever. The story you're about to hear is one of stealth, strategy, and shocking consequences. By the final years of World War II, Japan was a nation stretched to its limits. Its soldiers fought bravely across the Pacific, its cities endured relentless bombing, and yet, the empire still clung desperately to the hope of survival. At the heart of Japan's strength were its supply lines, the vast network of ships carrying food, oil, and weapons across treacherous waters. Without them, the mighty Japanese war machine would falter. But the Americans had discovered a secret weapon that would change everything: submarines that hunted silently, striking fear into the hearts of Japanese commanders. These were not ordinary attacks, they were calculated, relentless, and devastatingly effective. Convoys that once seemed secure vanished without a trace. Japan's resources dwindled, morale plummeted, and the commanders who once exuded confidence were left scrambling, stunned by the unseen force eroding their empire. In this video, we will take you deep beneath the waves, into the shadowy world of submarine warfare, and reveal how a handful of American submarines starved a superpower. Prepare to witness the shock, the desperation, and the quiet genius that turned the tide of history. By 1944, Japan's empire stretched across vast oceans, from the beaches of the Philippines to the islands of Southeast Asia. Yet, despite its vast territory, the nation was dangerously dependent on imports. Oil, rubber, rice, and metals, all crucial for both civilian life and military campaigns, had to be shipped across thousands of miles of open ocean. Japan's industry and war effort ran entirely on these fragile supply lines, making the empire both powerful and vulnerable at the same time. Japanese naval commanders had long believed that their fleets and fortified ports could protect these routes. Convoys of cargo ships, escorted by warships, moved cautiously from one port to another, braving the risk of storms and enemy attacks. The generals trusted in the strength of their navy, confident that no single force could cripple the arteries of the empire. But hidden threats lurked beneath the waves. American submarines, small and elusive, were systematically being deployed to patrol the Pacific. Unlike surface ships, these submarines could strike without warning, vanish into the darkness, and reappear elsewhere, making the oceans a deadly maze for Japanese supply convoys. Even experienced commanders underestimated the reach and stealth of this underwater menace. As Japan relied more heavily on imports to sustain its war machine, the stakes grew higher. Every lost convoy meant fewer resources for frontline soldiers, less fuel for planes and tanks, and a civilian population inching closer to famine. Japan's top commanders began to feel a creeping unease, sensing that their empire, so carefully built, could crumble not through conventional battle, but through starvation and attrition. The subtle tension between confidence and vulnerability defined this period. On paper, Japan still possessed formidable military power, but the reality beneath the surface told a different story, a story that the Americans had begun to exploit with deadly precision. The quiet, invisible war beneath the waves was about to shock Japanese leaders and change the course of the conflict forever. While Japan believed its convoys were safe behind escort ships and naval patrols, the Americans had been quietly perfecting a deadly countermeasure. Submarines, the silent predators of the Pacific, were deployed not merely as scouts or hunters of warships, but as strategic instruments of starvation. The U.S. Navy had identified Japan's dependence on imported oil, rice, and raw materials, and devised a plan that would strike at the very lifeblood of the empire. American submarines were small, maneuverable, and almost invisible in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Their commanders were trained to exploit every weakness, stalking convoys for days, calculating angles of attack, and striking with lethal precision. Torpedoes ripped through cargo ships under the cover of darkness, leaving nothing but shattered steel and drifting debris in their wake. Each successful strike sent shockwaves through Japanese command, as the true scale of the threat became apparent. Intelligence played a critical role. U.S. codebreakers had cracked Japanese communication systems, allowing submarine commanders to anticipate convoy movements and strike at the most vulnerable points. This combination of stealth, strategy, and intelligence made the submarines nearly unstoppable. Japanese commanders, accustomed to conventional naval engagements, were baffled and terrified by these unseen attacks. Their once confident assessments of convoy safety were shattered, and panic began to creep into strategic calculations. The campaign was not about glory or direct confrontation, it was a war of attrition, carried out in silence beneath the waves. The Americans aimed to cut off fuel for planes, ammunition for troops, and rice for civilians, knowing that the slow strangulation of Japan's supply lines would force the empire into a crisis far greater than any single battle. By the end of 1944, the effectiveness of this strategy was undeniable. Convoys were vanishing, cargo ships were sinking at an alarming rate, and Japanese commanders faced a dilemma they could not solve. This was not just naval warfare, it was psychological warfare. The ever-present fear of invisible hunters kept Japanese officers awake at night, second-guessing every decision, every convoy route. The strategy demonstrated that sometimes, the most devastating weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but patience, precision, and the ability to strike where the enemy is most vulnerable. As the American submarine campaign intensified, Japanese commanders were forced to confront a reality they had never anticipated. Reports from the front began arriving with alarming frequency. Convoys that had departed safely were vanishing without a trace, supply ships meant to bring essential food and fuel were gone, and morale among the crews was plummeting. The empire's leaders, once confident in their naval superiority, found themselves scrambling to respond to an enemy that seemed omnipresent beneath the waves. Internal communications reveal a mounting sense of panic. Commanders argued over new defensive strategies, shifting escort patterns, and desperate attempts to reroute supply lines. Yet, every plan seemed inadequate. Submarines appeared where least expected, striking with precision that bordered on the uncanny. Letters from the front, captured by intelligence later, described frustration and disbelief. "Our ships disappear as if swallowed by the ocean," wrote one officer, "the enemy knows our every move before we even begin." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical losses. Japanese commanders were not only dealing with missing ships and dwindling resources but also with the erosion of confidence among their own officers and sailors. Fear began to dominate decision-making, leading to overcaution, delays, and mistakes that only compounded the problem. High-ranking officials convened emergency meetings, but no solution seemed sufficient. The war they had planned to fight on their own terms was slipping beyond their control. What made the situation even more shocking was the invisibility of the threat. Unlike battles where forces confronted each other openly, submarines operated in silence, striking and disappearing without warning. This created a constant state of anxiety. Japanese leaders never knew where the next blow would come from or how many ships might be lost before dawn. By late 1944, it was clear that Japan's supply lines were being systematically dismantled. The shock experienced by commanders was not merely over lost resources, it was the realization that their entire strategy, the very foundation of their empire's strength, was vulnerable to a patient, invisible, and relentless enemy. Their confidence shattered, they were left to witness the empire slowly being starved from beneath the waves. As American submarines continued to strike Japan's supply convoys with devastating precision, the consequences extended far beyond the military. Civilians, who had so far been shielded from the front lines, began to feel the crushing weight of war in a way that no bombing or battle could deliver. Food, once abundant in Japanese cities, grew scarce. Rationing intensified, and families found themselves forced to survive on meager portions of rice, vegetables, and whatever substitutes could be found. Children went to bed hungry, mothers worried incessantly about their families, and communities that had once thrived now struggled just to maintain the barest semblance of normal life. Urban areas, particularly Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, witnessed growing queues outside shops, desperate for any scraps of sustenance. Black markets emerged. But the prices were astronomical, putting survival out of reach for ordinary citizens. The impact on health was catastrophic. Malnutrition became widespread, weakening children and adults alike. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from hunger-related illnesses. The Japanese government, desperate to maintain morale, struggled to manage public perception, issuing propaganda that attempted to downplay the crisis. Yet even the most patriotic citizen could not ignore the gnawing hunger that had become a daily reality. Military operations suffered as well. Soldiers returning from the front found their families weakened, their communities disrupted, and their own support systems collapsing. Supplies meant for civilians were sometimes diverted to the military, exacerbating the civilian crisis. Letters from soldiers reveal heart-wrenching scenes, parents unable to feed their children, families forced to make impossible choices, and the despair of a nation slowly being starved. The psychological toll mirrored the physical suffering. Fear, anxiety, and hopelessness became pervasive. Entire neighborhoods whispered about impending starvation, while children grew up with the constant shadow of hunger looming over their daily lives. For Japanese commanders, this civilian suffering added another layer of horror. They realized that their inability to protect supply lines was not just a military failure but a humanitarian disaster. By targeting Japan's lifelines, American submarines were waging a war that extended far beyond the ocean. They were silently starving a nation, weakening its morale, and creating desperation that no battlefield could match. The silent, unseen attacks left Japanese civilians trapped in a crisis engineered from afar, demonstrating that the power of strategy could reach into every home, every family, and every life, leaving an indelible mark on the history of the war. Course of the war in the Pacific. Japan, once confident in its vast navy and sprawling empire, now faced an undeniable truth: its supply lines were collapsing faster than it could repair them. Convoys that had once been routine became high-risk endeavors, and the losses were mounting. Every sunken cargo ship was a blow not only to the military but to the very survival of the nation. Japanese commanders scrambled to respond. They attempted to reroute convoys, increase escorts, and implement defensive measures, but the Americans were always one step ahead. Submarines struck with surgical precision, targeting the most critical shipments of oil, rice, and raw materials. The psychological impact on commanders was profound. Strategic confidence eroded, replaced by fear and uncertainty. Decisions that once seemed simple now carried catastrophic consequences. This period marked a turning point. Japan's war machine, already stretched thin, began to falter under the cumulative effects of starvation and supply shortages. Tanks sat idle due to lack of fuel, aircraft could not be deployed, and frontline troops faced dwindling ammunition. Civilians continued to suffer from malnutrition, their desperation feeding unrest and further weakening morale. Even loyal military personnel began questioning whether victory was still possible. The American strategy, though subtle, was ruthlessly effective. By striking the supply lines rather than the ports or cities directly, they avoided massive losses while inflicting maximum damage. Each successful attack sent shockwaves through Japan's high command, forcing a re-evaluation of defensive priorities and revealing the empire's vulnerability in stark terms. For the Japanese, the turning point was not a single battle but a slow, inexorable collapse, a war of attrition waged beneath the waves. Commanders could no longer rely on numbers, firepower, or territory. They faced an enemy that struck silently, strategically, and with devastating effect. By the end of 1944, it was clear that Japan's position in the Pacific was untenable, and the empire's confidence, once unshakable, had been thoroughly undermined. The lesson was stark: war could be won not just through brute force but through strategy, patience, and the ability to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. The submarines had starved a nation, shocked its commanders, and altered the trajectory of history forever. The American submarine campaign against Japan stands as one of the most remarkable examples of strategic warfare in history. By targeting supply lines instead of engaging in direct, large-scale battles, the United States Navy demonstrated that careful planning, intelligence, and patience could be more decisive than sheer force. The success of these operations reshaped naval strategy and underscored the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful empires. For Japan, the campaign revealed glaring weaknesses in leadership, logistics, and strategic foresight. Commanders had relied too heavily on the assumption that geography and fleet strength would protect supply routes. The realization that a small number of submarines could cripple an entire nation forced a painful re-evaluation of military doctrine. It was a lesson in humility, adaptability, and the peril of underestimating an invisible enemy. The campaign also highlighted the broader human cost of strategic warfare. While military victories are often measured in ships sunk or battles won, the real impact was felt by civilians who endured hunger and deprivation. The slow strangulation of Japan's resources not only weakened its military capabilities but also eroded morale and faith in leadership. These outcomes demonstrated that the most effective strategies often operate on multiple levels, combining tactical brilliance with psychological pressure. Moreover, the campaign left enduring lessons for military historians and strategists. It showed that modern warfare is not confined to front lines. It can extend to supply chains, infrastructure, and economic systems. By cutting off essential resources, a small force of submarines achieved results that larger, conventional operations might never have accomplished. The silent hunters of the Pacific proved that wars could be fought, and won, through stealth, intelligence, and precision rather than direct confrontation. Ultimately, the American submarine campaign against Japan reshaped the Pacific theater and offered an enduring example of strategic innovation. Commanders learned the cost of complacency, nations saw the vulnerability of dependence, and history recorded a silent, deadly campaign that starved a superpower while shocking its leaders. The reverberations of this strategy would influence naval doctrine for decades, proving that sometimes, the unseen hand can deliver the most decisive blow. The story of Japan's starvation at the hands of American submarines is a powerful reminder of the unseen forces that can alter the course of history. It was not a single battle, not a massive fleet clash, that broke the empire, but a patient, calculated campaign waged in silence beneath the waves. The shock experienced by Japanese commanders, the desperation of civilians, and the strategic brilliance of the Americans combined to create one of World War II's most consequential and underappreciated campaigns. By cutting off vital supplies of food, fuel, and raw materials, the submarines effectively strangled Japan's war machine. Commanders who had once exuded confidence found themselves powerless against an enemy they could not see, unable to predict, and incapable of stopping. Each lost convoy brought the nation closer to collapse, each successful strike a testament to the importance of strategy over brute force. The human cost was immense. Families went hungry, soldiers grew weaker, and the morale of a nation teetered on the edge of despair. Yet amidst this tragedy, the campaign also demonstrated the effectiveness of intelligence, innovation, and foresight. The Americans had shown that warfare was not solely about guns and bombs, it was about understanding the enemy, exploiting weaknesses, and delivering decisive blows where they would have the greatest impact. As the war drew to its conclusion, the consequences of the submarine campaign were undeniable. Japan's ability to sustain its military operations had been crippled, and its leaders were forced to confront the limits of their empire. The campaign left a lasting legacy on military strategy, teaching future generations that stealth, patience, and precision could achieve what might seem impossible. Ultimately, the The story of Japan's starvation is more than a tale of lost ships or depleted supplies. It is a testament to strategy, human ingenuity, and the profound consequences of unseen forces. The shock felt by Japanese commanders, the suffering endured by civilians, and the brilliance of the American submariners all serve as a stark reminder: in war, sometimes the quietest weapons leave the loudest echoes.